Hi everyone, happy May the 4th. I saw on the calendar that it's going to be May the 4th and say, why not do something that Jedi always do on May the 4th? And that is testing APIs. So I was thinking about what would a good idea to do after the last few sessions that I'm going to mention more than one time, which went into details about planning and designing test cases for APIs. And I thought about doing some kind of a high-level thing about best practices. I usually don't refer to best practices as best because best means best everywhere, even in galaxies far, far away. But things that work for most people most of the time. So I'm going to go over things and examples about what we need to think about when we're doing API testing from all kinds of perspectives, and I hope you find it valuable. And not promise that you'll become a Jedi, but maybe you will. Can't promise anything. So my name is Gil. I'm a consultant and a trainer about everything that helps people become better at software. That means developers, testers, the combination, product people, DevOps. I'm the author of 2 books, Everyday Unit Testing and Everyday Spring Testing, and I do these kind of videos and webinars, and I will do even more so. And I have a YouTube channel that you can also subscribe to, and when you see it on YouTube, you're already there. So that's like a prophecy waiting to happen. Other than that, I'm also on Twitter and other channels as well. So look out. So what are we here for? Well, I'm going to start at the end. The end goal is that we'll have working software over and over again. I always say that because that is true. That's what we want. We want something working. And when we're talking about APIs, and APIs usually, it's a side effect of software. It's something that it's an artifact that we use in order to check what our software, what our system is doing. We want to if that's the goal of software, the goal of testing is to learn as much as we can and understand as much as we can. So we on the system itself, so we can report it to stakeholders and we can make decisions based on what we find. We find a lot of bugs, we don't fix them. We don't find a lot of bugs. We start asking other questions like more features, which features, and where to invest our work in. So this is what we want, and a lot of things that we're going to talk about today is supposed to bring us to this goal. Want to mention that this is one of our instructors, Testing Gil. There's a course for that. If you're interested in API testing workshops for developers or for testers, combinations of them, I have workshops that I do with clients about this and go a lot more deeper than what we're going to do today with Star Wars, sometimes with Star Trek, but we're not going to mention that today, about testing APIs and the philosophy behind it, the actuality, the practices, and how to do it more effectively. So think about what you're going to see today as a taste of what you can get. If we have any questions on, write them in the Q&A box, please. I'll try to look at them as I go, as I'm talking, but if not, I'm going to turn to the questions at the end of this session. So when Obi-Wan and Luke Skywalker came into Mos Eisley, Obi-Wan said, "You will never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy." And that's how I think about code, really, and softwares. I'm not sure that that's the initial goal of what we're building, but it's very complex and it's badly coded in something that's not that well tested. I'm not sure scam and villainy, but sometimes it gets pretty close to that. We have a code for that. Call it legacy code, but that's what we're talking about. We have a lot of configurations for our system. A lot of them is distributed, and they are complex. It's not if maybe we're doing some data-driven stuff that is very simple, like update data, get the data, and even that can get complex. But most of the stuff that we do is not simple. Otherwise, people have done it already. So it gets complex. It's what we called essential complexity. The problem that we're solving is already complex. How we solve it is accidental complexity and raises the bar even more. So we need to learn as much as we can. We can do it from documentation. Sometimes it's not that good, and sometimes it's not that updated, doesn't contain all the stuff, but because it's complex, when we're going to attack the system, we need to prepare and become masters, like the teacher here, who went through a couple of topics already. How do you become a master? So, like I said, some of it is documentation. So I usually, when the first sentence is, I've got this API to test. Well, we don't have API to test. We have features to test. We have system to test. And we need to learn as much as we can about the systems. Like I said, we can do it from documentation, but we need to do a lot more research from it. We need to understand the context that it's going to be used. We're talking about APIs. It's like a slice of the software. And again, don't think about it like I need to test an API. We need to test features, functionality through these kind of APIs. We need to understand what works and how. So even when you were given an API test, as is, it can have different functionalities. So example that I always give before we jump into Star Wars APIs. Think about you have an API that does a login into a system. So the first time, and you try to give it an invalid password, so it gives you a try again result. You try again with another and fail, and it says, are you even trying? And the next time you try again with invalid password, it will shut you down, lock you out. And not just that, it will lock you out from all the other APIs. So we have the same API used 3 times with 3 different results, sometimes system-wide result. And if we want to get even more complex than that, why do you think about that the lockdown is timed because we're nice people. So after an hour, the lockdown will be off and we can start the cycle again. So again, same API, but this time it's displaced in time and we get different results. So that's one API and different sets of results. And with the same inputs and parameters, different responses because the system is complex, because the logic is complex. So it's not just like take an API and test it, but we need to think about different contexts. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So Swappy, it's the Star Wars API. What is a Star Wars API? Well, it is what it says in the box. It's really an API to test for APIs to call to get information about Star Trek. So this is like calling it. I'll show you live examples, or hopefully live example like this. You ask it for a resource, it will get you information in JSON. This is very cool. If you go to the documentation here, so this is good documentation. It's actually nice, detailed. It will give you the base URL. It gives you other things that you might want to consider having in your actual work. So, for example, you have like rate limiting stuff. Rate limiting means that how many calls, what kind of a load it can take. So think about it. Usually we don't get this at the API level, we get it at the server level, and that can change. This can work today like this, but tomorrow we can put in another a load balancer, or a few more servers or containers that will take more load over us. So this is kind of an interesting thing to know. Authentication. This is completely open API. You won't need any authentication to do, but what kind of authentication do we need? What kind of functionality do we expect when you have different authentication levels or authorization levels? So think about what we have and check if it's documented, if you can get this information, if we can collect this information from different sources and tie it together. So Swappy helps us in a very nice authentication. It tells you about the schema. You can actually get the schema from by calling an API, which is nice. It's something, another interesting thing here. Not much, but when you start out and you only have Swagger, or for example, Swagger documentation, and it tells you that this gets you this kind of data with this example and gets you 200, it's a nice start, but usually we need a lot of more examples to understand the context, unless the context is very simple. Again, it could be that it's very simple, but even the most simple thing can go wrong. So we need some kind of error messages or error responses and know what to expect. So we need to do this. So that's documentation. It's very good to have. So Quig and Jean tell us to focus. Your focus determines our reality, and that's very true. And how do we apply it to testing and API testing? Well, I just talked about how complex things can get, and they can get a lot more complex, and people who've worked that know that. So we don't have all the time in the world, but first of all, we can think of everything that can go wrong, and things will go wrong. But we need to think all kinds of combinations and contexts and configurations and inputs and what header fields. We can think about a lot of things that we can try to test and see how they work. But out of this thing, and we can think about all kinds of cases. And if you want to go think about how you do that, you can go out, check out the session about API test planning. Out of all this, we need to focus on what's important. So because we don't have all the time to either test or automate or repeat these kind of things without automation. So we need to think about how to do that and what to do and what to do first. Because if you're focusing on the wrong stuff, on not important stuff, it's probably going to waste our time. So here's an example. I'm going to jump into Postman here. So my example is going to be from Swappy today. So you go to the root API, the base URL, you check that, you press send, everything connected. So I get the things. So you get like the APIs for the different resources, which is very nice. You get something like that. Well, what do you focus on? What you're interested in? Well, most people will try the people and maybe the plan, the films, get information about that. And less people will probably, but very fanatic ones, will check out the species and the vehicles. So who's your audience? Maybe decide based on knowledge from the product and the users what you're going to focus your testing on, because we don't have all the time in the world. So even things like that can get you some kind of information or some kind of the direction where you actually want to go. And just remember that Quigan also said, I think it's Quigan. No, it's Obi-Wan. In my experience, there's no such thing as luck. So we actually need to be more determine what we're going to test and have a plan and prioritize it and work according to the plan. Otherwise, it's like just shooting asteroids in space. You may hit something or not. Probably better to hit something. So plan ahead. So this quote is from when Luke was running around Dagobah with Yoda on his back, and Yoda shouting at him about different things. And one of them is you will only find what you bring in, which is kind of a deep thing, like Yoda talks about, because he's a very, very deep green thing. And I thought, well, this is very interesting because I talk about it sometimes. We usually don't discuss these things enough. What is this thing that we bring in with us? Well, that's assumptions. We have assumptions about how things are supposed to work and how they worked until now, and therefore they need to continue to work this way. And our assumptions are basically based on our experience with other products, with the same developers, and the product itself, and our history of testing this kind of system. Bring a lot of this set of assumptions in, and kind of directs us to what we're looking at. And the problem with that is that when we're like doing testing right now, or we're doing automation, or building something that will run automatically for now, but with every cycle of build, these kind of assumptions that we don't document them. So when something breaks like 3 months from now, and we look at this, why are we testing this at all? And there's a reason that we have this kind of script, not just because the API exists, but this kind of test what happens when the database is almost full, and we don't see it in the code of the test. And there's a reason for that, because we have limited resources, maybe we're running on a board or something like that, and we want to test this kind of scenario. A lot of assumptions of why we build stuff stay in our head, and that's not a good place to be. I know my head, at least. So we need to do a couple of things about it. The first thing, we need to be aware of what we're assuming. If you're trying to run a test and you assume that this is going to run on consistent data, that's very easy to assume. But maybe in CI, it will run after a test, and the former test will break and leave data in the system in an inconsistent state. So our starting point for our tests is not what we imagine it to be or what we assumed it to be. If we actually talk about this, or document or whatever, we can review this assumption and tell, is it safe to assume that or not? If it's not safe to assume that, and we need to define the starting point, we'll need to create this starting point by ourselves, make sure the data is consistent in some way, like load new data or use a new or fresh container. Doesn't really matter. But once we talked about this, we can do something about it. We need more people in the loop right now so they can corroborate our assumptions or disprove them. And we need some kind of a documentation that's saying, well, this is how we did it this way. And usually this comes with a trauma, because usually it worked until our assumption was disproved somewhere wrong, and then we changed the test in order to now help ourselves pass the test under the new correct assumptions. But we need to make sure that other people know that as well. So assumptions for testing, that's true anywhere, not just about APIs. We need to verbalize these things. We need to talk about what is thing that we're assuming, and maybe that's okay that we're assuming that. Like, the system will always run on Linux. That's good. But when it fails because it ran on a Windows system somewhere in the future, because somebody made a big pact with Microsoft, it will stop working. Ask why. If it's not documented, it's just like going to waste some time later. It's probably not going to be disastrous, unless it is, but it's going to waste some time. So the more we discuss our assumptions, the more we document them, it will probably save us more time in the future. So Yoda also tells us that dark side clouds everything. And I'm going to back to talking about complexity. Our system are complex. We probably want to see how our code is working, but it's not really true because our code is like this thing out of the whole system because we're running servers and libraries and platforms and queues and databases that we just use, we haven't written yet. So we actually want to see how the system works, not just how our code works. And we need to think about what can go wrong with the other stuff. And one of the things that I want to show you is REST by itself. So we're using, my examples, I'm using a Swappy with Postman, REST APIs. And for me, it's like a black box. I haven't written a Star Wars API, just a user of that. But I know it's working on HTTP, and HTTP does things based on strings, for example. So let me see what I can think about when I'm checking the API. So if you use the API /people/3, it will bring you information about R2D2 because this is the draw that I am looking for. Now, if you go by the documentation, this is how you're going to see how it's going to be used. Like you go to /people/number, and it's going to be used. But is it the only way to get it? Well, let's see what happens if I do /people/the name R2D2. So when we do that, we get a 404, not found, and also a nice message saying not found, a JSON response body. And what did I do here? Well, I'm just using a path variable with what I thought HTTP can take, right? It can take that. It's a string. It can do whatever I want here. I can put to drop tables and see what happens then. But this is something I need to be aware of. So maybe the integration with REST, and I'm not sure what they're using on the back end, can consume this thing as a path variable and see if that works. So we need to think about different kind of informations and how you get there. And unfortunately, I tried something and didn't work. That's fine. But sometimes we need to understand that we can do other stuff, and I'm not sure if that makes it life easier. So here, for example, we have people 13, which gets us Chewbacca with all kinds of information about Chewbacca, which is very nice, which films, species, so on. Nice. Nice thing about this, if you read the documentation about Swappy, is that you can get this information not just in English, but in Wookiee. So if you do that, remember that's number 13. So if you send a query about a query parameter called format and put a Wookiee in it, you get this kind of response, which is cool. The question is that correct? Is this the correct data? So if you look, and you had the mouse back, if you get if you compare this kind of thing like the 228 and 112, yeah, it's in the right place, so probably the right data, but is this how you write Chewbacca in Wookiee? I don't know. So when you're testing things with other languages or other encoding, you need to make sure that you actually know how to say if the answer is right or wrong, because I'm not sure if this is correct. I'm guessing it's true, but I have no idea how to check if this information is true. And sometimes we get into this kind of areas where we need to actually need some kind of guidance of how do we know that these things are correct? Okay. So far, the mouse works correctly. Excellent. So Qui-Gon Jinn told Jar Jar here that the ability to speak does not make you intelligent, and that is true. What does make us intelligent? Well, things that help us test better makes us better testers, I think. So let's look about at different aspects of these things and see how we're doing here. Mouse exists. Excellent. So this is the same API that got us R2D2 things. And if you read the documentation, you say that there is no update mechanism. So there is no post API to update information or to add a new thing. It actually says that if you need to update something, send the owner an email, he will update it for us. So think about this. There's no way to know if the information that we get is correct unless we reference some other references. And this is bad enough. So let's compare it to the real world. In this, we have a get without a post. So basically, we have a read capability that we don't have any write capability. So if you want to run like automated tests or a sequence of APIs, setting things up to read, only read something is going to be an issue. Same with the other way around. So we have posts, but we don't have gets. So we have like an update mechanism, an update API that changes data. How do I know the data actually changed? I need some kind of observability mechanisms to look at that. Maybe I look at the database. What if I don't have any permissions to do that? What if I need special permissions? So that creates a lot of problems. So when talking about operability and observability, the way to invoke stuff or set up things and the way to read them, this is something that's very important for us. We don't have them. We need to get them somehow. If it's not easy to get, we'll probably waste a lot of time doing that. We don't like that. Here's another thing. So this is a GraphQL. So we are mostly familiar with REST as a format or architecture that we use in order to call APIs, but it's not the only one. There's something called GraphQL, which is a way to query data, also change it, much like REST allows us to do. But instead of in REST, what we have multiple APIs or multiple endpoints, in GraphQL, you only get one. So for example, here what I'm doing, you can see it's not the same URL, but it is said to be working on the same data. So I'm sending a post to this endpoint, and the body's kind of structure with the query. So if I do this, what I get is the server kind of fill in the blanks. So it returns data, all films, and I requested all the titles of all the films. So it just gives me title, New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, and so on. Now, this is interesting because it's kind of two interfaces on the same data. I need to make sure that things are working the same. So we need to make sure that things are working from all perspectives, all points of views. So and if I have different perspectives on the data, different APIs, I need to check them all. If I have combinations of these things, I need to check them all. So this is like, if you compare this to the real world where we have, if you have a get all, let's say you have a record and you can update it with a post and you can get it by ID, like a R2D2 thing, and we have get all. One of the things we want to do is if we create something and get the item, get all also returns this item. So we need to think about different perspectives of where the data can be viewed or can be located. The other thing, which is basically the same query, I think, which kind of, when I wrote it, actually led me to think about this thing, is that when we're testing about the API, usually, again, going back to assumptions, if we do a get, like our get here with R2D2, this runs in isolation against a server that I run, which is cool. This doesn't, right? We are testing right against a live server. So if something changes now in the server, I wouldn't know about it. I may see a problem with that. If running this automatically with every build, we may see a problem. So we need to understand that this thing can run in isolation or a shared server or not. We need to know about what's happening. When we're doing that, we need to think about what will happen if things happen concurrently. Postman, by the way, doesn't lead us to do that. We kind of think about things running synchronously, one after the other. But think about like real-world application when we were updating something. If we're talking about things that start doing something and can take a couple of jumps, a couple of hops, or a couple of APIs, or a couple of services, depending on your architectures, to perform this operation, it may not happen until the API returns. And now we need to start to think about things that are running in parallel, or starting one before the other, or ending one before the other. What happens if you're scheduling a meeting with an API, then you cancel a meeting, but this one wasn't created yet. Well, you need to think about what these kind of cases that are interesting to us, and we lead there just by understanding how the system works. Sure, we can probably test the same thing with synchronous systems, but if we understand the system is running asynchronously in the backend, we need to think about how to create this kind of situation, check how the system works in that situations. So think about what happens when we think about things, but we need to actually either prove them as things working or check how they are doing in different situations. Where's Jar Jar? There, Jar Jar. So Darth Vader tells his director, be careful not to choke on your aspirations. What is our aspirations? Well, our aspirations to do things more effectively. So I already threw you some kind of things of perspectives of how to think about your testing. Let's do some more. Okay, so when we had like R2D2 here, let's see something working. Before we do that, yeah, with this R2D2, let's see what happens like edge cases. Usually don't use edge cases or negative cases. Let's search for something that is not there and see what's happening. I think we already saw an example of that with the string there, but this is an ID that doesn't exist in the database. So you get 404 and you get a not found. Okay. Remember I showed you the GraphQL one, right? So first of all, think about, before we go to GraphQL, think about what can go wrong, edge cases, different inputs, interesting. Well, things that you can see if you go to the API test planning session. I dug deep into these kind of examples. Let's go to the GraphQL though, because this is something that is interesting, because this is what I did when. So this is searching for a person, which is number 3, the ID of R2D2, and this is what it returns. So first of all, what I did here was asking the questions, what happens if I do the same with the GraphQL interface? And this is not exactly the same thing, right? So you can see that it has name, gender, and home world, while, because I asked for name, gender, but it gives me home world name, because it's very nice if this is what I'm asking. And the question is, R2D2 data through the REST interface. Let's go back to here. It gives me a lot of things. So I can play with different interfaces and see if they actually expose the same data. Now, what I did is, well, how does it look like if I'm going to search for something that is not there, like I did with the example? So, yep, sorry. So this is interesting. First of all, it doesn't work. First of all, it gives me a 200. So, is it working? Not working? It's not like the 404 I got at the REST level. But that's okay, because it's a GraphQL. It behaves differently. I need to understand the difference between these things. The second thing that is interesting is that the message that I get is no entry in local cache. Now, let's assume I don't know how these things really work, because actually I don't. I haven't built the server. I do know that the GraphQL is working on top of the Swappy API, and therefore it calls itself. So I can understand that it might hold a local cache for that to perform better, so on. Does it need to tell me that, though? Well, it looks like a developer wrote it for some other developer. Because if you actually look for that, almost no user in Star Wars will actually look and says, ah, there's a cache there. I knew it. But I saw a lot of things that are exposed as developer errors that should probably not be exposed to actual users. So when you're doing exploration, and this is the practice that I'm talking about here, is that try other things that you might not just be around different cases, but also look around for the things that come up. And you might be surprised at what you learn about the system. Now, what is that wrong? Probably not. Is it destructive? Probably not. Is it the Death Star end? Probably not. But things that can go wrong. If, for example, we update the server of the GraphQL to not hold a cache, it always goes directly to the single source of truth at the Swappy server and gets data from there, but we forget to repair the message. So the message will probably waste us time when something goes wrong if we'll try to debug it. Again, not disastrous, not earth-shattering or Alderaan-shattering, but it can create a waste that we don't want to. Another thing that we might want to do is do or do not, there is no try. So this is again what R2D2 returns, right? And this time I wrote tests. So I wrote two tests. One of them checks the status. It gets 200, that's okay. Is that okay? Probably not. I probably need something more narrow, something more precise to fail things on a build. So I will check that it's 200. Also check that I'm looking for R2D2, and that means that the JSON that returns the name field is R2D2. Well, what else can I do here? Well, I can check, maybe that's enough. Maybe checking that if I requested R2D2 data, I got something that looks like JSON and has a field name. This name has R2D2, and that means everything other than that can be whatever it wants to be, or maybe not. We can compare full JSONs. I can create like something that has the complete data, like save this and compare it. If something's changed, that's a problem. Let's look, if you scroll down, you'll see that the record that returns also two fields created and edited. You can assume maybe that created doesn't ever change. Probably, if one guy who only updates R2D2 files when they get it in their emails, the creator field probably doesn't change, but maybe editor does. Maybe it does change. So if we compare whole JSONs, we need to not compare these kind of things, or we don't have to check timestamps, or in the real world IDs. So IDs may be different, but the data they represent are the same. So we need to be more precise about what we're testing. So do not. Don't try. Don't do something in the middle. Think about what you want to fail the build on. So this is Darth Maul, and he was very inventive because he got 2 sabers, and now he's twice as better as Qui-Gon Jinn, and he actually proved it. So a Jedi uses the Force for knowledge and defense, never for attack. And Darth Maul is a Sith Lord, so he doesn't know this, and actually uses it for attack. But what we can learn from that is that we should use the right tool for the right job. I showed you examples in Postman, and Postman is a very good tool for doing what I showed you. But if you want to run concurrent requests, it's not a good tool. It doesn't do that. It's also not good at other things. It's not an IDE. It's very hard to maintain code in it. It's very hard to edit code in it. It's very hard to debug code in it. You need lots of logging, like we're talking about debugging methods of 20 years ago. So we need to use the right tool, to pick the tool for the right job. And I talked about this with a couple more examples on the designing API test cases session, because everybody's using Postman, and I'm using Postman as an example. I know it's not like I'm writing on Postman right now. I like it a lot. But if everybody is using some kind of platform, and I give you another example, everybody on the developers side who are writing API tests in a client of mine, we're using Kubernetes containers to manage their sessions. So they built their own containers with their own files and loaded them, and everything was running on distributedly. Very complex way to tell you your code is working correctly. There are better ways to do that. And the thing that is everybody's doing it this way doesn't mean that we need to do it if we have other purposes. So it's not that a bad thing that they were running Kubernetes. It's a good thing for some of the tests, not for all of them. So they needed other method. So question whether you're using the right tool for the right job. Obi-Wan said to Anakin, "It was said that you would destroy the Sith, not join them." And I say, maybe that's not a bad idea after all. So I'm not talking about mortal enemies like developers and testers, because we need to work together. It's not just developers. It's everybody working together, developers, testers, product people, designers, architects, DevOps people. The more we work together, our testing will get better. And testing is better when it gets to the goal that it needs to do. So if we test better, we know more about the system, we can get better, and we can create and make better decisions about what to do next based on what we learn. More than 20 years ago, when I was a young team lead, and we had very big problems, like whenever my tester got a hand on a build, they would just throw them back to the developer, and a lot of tension in the team. And this is before I even knew what Agile was. I just told them, sit together, work out together. The tester didn't know anything about coding. She was a biologist. and a very good tester. The developer didn't know anything about testing because obviously, and so they were just sitting together and talking, and the developer did something and showed the results, and she said, that's okay, that's not okay, it should be like this. And we got a lot better just by collaborating. Do more collaboration with, join them. Final thing I want to talk about is not necessarily about API testing or testing in general, but everything that we, well, let's talk about testing in general anyway. I talked a lot about a lot of things in terms of practices, in terms of product knowledge, the assumption things, how we actually do stuff, the tools that we use. There's a lot going in there, so and a lot going in here. And we need to pass this information to other people as well. And this has to be, I believe, systematically in the organizations, but even if it's not doing less formally, we need, if we, let's assume that we are the masters, that we know how to do these things. We may not be in the organization tomorrow, or we may need to move to other projects, more interesting ones. We need it to other people to understand what they're doing. So pairing is not just with the other people who are doing other jobs in the projects. Also between testers. Pair testing is something that's very, very near and dear to my heart. You can learn a lot from it, even if you're the masters. And we've seen a lot of films, Jedi related, that this happens as well. This information, there's a lot of tacit information that sits in our head, and we just know how to do things. Sometimes it's very hard to explain why we're doing them, because we've done them a lot. But people who are going to maintain our automated test in 6 months from now and may not even have joined that organization yet. So we need to systematically transfer this knowledge. Hopefully, and most of the time when we do this, it saves us time later. It frees us to do more things, sometimes more interesting things, and not repeat ourselves. And basically, as an organization point of view, we come up with better results because that's what we want. Better software that works over and over again. And this is the way, some of it at least, of what I see and what I usually help people to understand about testing, because it is complex. It's not like just check that the API works. There's a lot behind it, and I hope you got some information out of it that you can try tomorrow if you haven't tried it yet. Sometimes we don't think about how complex is our world and what a lot of knowledge we have and what we are up against. And if you think about how we can test better, we can actually improve on these things. And that's what I wanted to share with you today on this May the 4th. So I hope you had some fun. We're going to return in the next sessions to our galaxy and our planet. I want to thank you for coming today and joining me and join 4th session. If you follow up on my social media up here on different things, and we have an email that you will get information about the recordings when it's up, so on, and other things. If you're interested in my courses or in workshops, let me know. Otherwise, thank you very much for coming today, and see you next time. Bye-bye. Hey everyone, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more. Thanks for the support, and remember, live long and test.